Hello, and thank you for tuning in to the Keto Answers podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Anthony Gustin, and this week joining me is Dr. Shawn Baker. Shawn is an MD, and he's someone who is kind of the godfather of the carnivore diet currently. And I'm thinking about renaming the show the Carnivore Answers podcast because we're talking so much about it. But I think it's just one of these trends that's coming up so often and pairs really well with the ketogenic diet into helping reverse a lot of people's health problems. And so Shawn has been using this on himself for over a year. And if you're not sure what the carnivore diet is, it's just basically eating animal products only. And so we dig into this episode about why that would be beneficial, the risks, the safety, the concerns, all of the questions people have about it. Shawn's the main guy to go to on this stuff. So it was fun to chat with him and dig into something that I've worked with a little bit and play with myself, and something that he's been doing for well over a year. So if you have any questions about animal products, if they're good for you, if they're bad for you, if you're questioning doing a carnivore diet, this episode is for you. So tune in, and I hope you enjoy. Before we get to the episode, I wanted to chat about our sponsor, Perfect Keto. Perfect Keto is all about making a ketogenic diet healthy and accessible. Whether you're reading all of our online guides or articles or enjoying Perfect Keto's exogenous ketones or any other keto-friendly products, everything you need to make keto work for you is at perfectketo.com. I know what you're thinking. Hey, aren't you the founder of Perfect Keto? Yep, that's right. And all of my insanely high standards have been put into making each and every product. My background as a functional medicine clinician helps me craft the cleanest and healthiest possible products and the best information about a ketogenic diet. Head on over to perfectketo.com to learn anything you need to know about the ketogenic diet. And if you've never tried any of our products before, feel free to use the code KETOPODCAST for 20% off your first order. With that being said, let's get into the show. All right, Doc, thanks for being on the show today.
Hey, Anthony, great to be here.
So you're like the de facto carnivore expert in the world now. How did that happen? And for people who don't know, it's just the carnivore diet for people who have been living under the rock and not listening to any of this podcast is something that I'm doing personally right now. It's eating only animal products. And you've kind of been the key leader, I would say, and spokesperson for this entire movement. I would say, especially in the last year or so.
Yeah, I mean, and I want to give credit where credit's due. There are a lot of people that have been doing this longer than me. There's some people out there that have got, been doing this for 10 years or more that have been around. I've been very vocal about it, probably because of I just see such a huge potential in bringing this into a larger stream. Some of the other folks were kind of quietly going about their business doing it and not really trying to promote it. And I think it has such a powerful impact on all kinds of diseases, and I think it's something that needs to be out there. So I've been very vocal about promoting it. I've also, went pretty in depth about trying to look at some of the science and trying to figure out why some of the things are happening that don't seem to make sense. If you look at a carnivore diet, it really breaks all the nutritional rules that we've been told are true, and we're finding that the opposite's true, and trying to make sense of that. So I've kind of dug into as much of the research that's out there. Now, there's not much actually done on strict carnivore diets, but there's stuff that you can kind of infer from some of the other literature, and that's what I've been doing, and I've been obviously very vocal about it and getting good results. I think other people have also, as they've jumped on trying it themselves. We see lots of people just getting really, really impressive results with this sort of thing. So I think it's kind of neat to see how it evolves.
How did you lead yourself down the rabbit hole to get where you're at now? And did you ever think that this is something that was a healthy diet? Because your background, you were a surgeon for a long period of time. Is this correct?
Yeah, so I went to conventional medical training. I had the standard doctor training that everybody else has. I specialized in orthopedic surgery, did that for a couple of decades. And then, just like everybody else, as you get older, you try to figure out, as your health starts to get worse, as happens to so many people as we get older, try to figure out why that is. And so I'd already had the athletic and the exercise portion down pretty well. I've been doing that my whole life, but despite that, I still was developing kind of diseases of age, and I wanted to see what I could do to prevent that. So I just went down the nutrition rabbit hole and tried all kinds of different diets, from near vegetarian diets to paleo, low carb, a diet like Clarence Bass used to use, a high fiber diet, ketogenic diet for a couple years. And then finally, I just tried the carnivorous diet. And yeah, if you would have asked me 5 years ago what I thought about a carnivorous diet, I would have said it's absolutely crazy. It doesn't make any sense at all, because I still was sort of boxed in by the current nutritional dogma. And it's not till I kind of just sort of looked outside the box a little bit, tried it myself, saw the good results, and then try to figure out how to explain it that happened.
How did you feel in these different stages? So you went from kind of a vegetarian approach to a paleo approach to a keto approach. Did you notice benefits at each of these stages compared to where you were at the starting point before?
Yeah, I mean, so if you and part of it has to do with, kind of athletics, because when I started, I was still heavily involved in strength sports, Highland Games. I was, a pretty big guy. I was close to 300 pounds, but most of it was muscle, but I still had a little more extra body fat than I probably needed. But you had to be big like that to compete in that sort of sport. I was even considered small by a lot of the standards there, because a lot of the guys are 350 pounds, 6'9", and stuff like that. So some big guys, but and so I went on this, the first thing I did was, well, I'm going to do what everybody else always tells you to do: cut calories and exercise more and eat low fat. And I did that. And sure enough, through quite a bit of discipline and effort and a lot of exercise, I was able to drop about 50 pounds in about 3 months. I got leaner. I did feel better. But at the same time, I was constantly hungry and, just kind of irritable. And then losing that much weight, you're going to lose some strength, and that inevitably happened. And I just found it wasn't sustainable for me long term. It's not that it doesn't work and people don't make it work, but I think from trying to make that sort of diet, low fat, low calorie, caloric restriction, being in a deficit long periods of time, is just not very sustainable. And anybody would agree with that. And so I just needed more food, and I needed specifically more animal nutrition. I felt that I was lacking that because I was eating very little of it. And then as I went into a paleo diet, I maintained my level of leanness. My strength came up a bit, and I felt quite a bit better. And then I just kind of continued reading the research, and then I felt that going on a ketogenic helped me with some health issues, like things like joint pain. I think there's pretty good evidence now that we're seeing that joint pain, in a lot of cases, arthritis, tendonitis, and some of those things, is related to diet. And so cutting certain things out of the diet and perhaps adding certain things into the diet can help with that. And that's what I experienced. And then just when I went on a carnivorous diet, I just found that was the way I felt the best, the way I performed the best. It's allowed me to become stronger and remain very lean. And, all those things that we often attribute to aging, like, achy joints or skin issues or digestion and stuff like that, those all things went away. And I thought that was just very, very interesting.
What made you want to do it in the first place? Was it to get a little bit more performance? Because I know that you're still a competitive athlete now.
Right. Yeah. So I was always looking at, I'm very much a competitive athlete, and I always want to try to do the things that I can that are legal. I don't take drugs or anything like that, but that legally allow me to perform better. And so I was just reading about, some of the older athletes, older time strength athletes, and some of the stuff in history, and seeing some people that were doing this and seemingly getting leaner and putting on muscle and getting stronger. And so I thought I'd just try that. And so I did. I initially only planned on doing it for 30 days, and that's what I did. And I did a 30-day trial about, I guess it's been 16 months ago that I started this. And then when I finished my 30 days, I thought, well, that was pretty neat. That's pretty cool. And then I went back to the way I had been eating before, and I just noticed I didn't feel as good. And so I after a day or two, I went right back onto a strictly carnivorous diet, and I've been that way ever since, and still continuing to, get stronger and healthier. And so that's just kind of where I'm at right now.
What are the things that you noticed that you went back to eating that you felt? Was it like lower energy? Was it more inflammation? Was it a little bit of bloating?
Yeah, I mean, it was some digestive bloating. It was a little bit of inflammation, some soreness in joints, and just feeling sluggish, and just not feeling as good. And I think the things, and it wasn't that I was eating a bunch of junk. I mean, I remember the day that I went back, it was just some fruit, some nut butter, a bunch of heavy cream. I think I had a few, little bars, like not Quest bars, but something similar to that. I might have had some lentils or something like that. I can't remember exactly what I had that day, but overall and some rice and lentils, I think. And I didn't feel, I just didn't feel good. And so it was pretty immediate that I noticed that. And I think some of that has to do with the change in the microbiome. I think there's times where here's the thing, because a lot of people go on a carnivorous diet and they'll notice that a small amount of foods that they could tolerate before tend to mess them up, particularly with gastrointestinal symptoms. And I think that's probably I think that's just what it is. I think the microbiome and the gut has to get used to processing those foods again. But I think something that beyond that, if you go back to eating, let's say in the past, you ate, whatever, some kind of sugar or something like that, and it messes up your digestive system. That's probably just the fact that your digestive system isn't used to handling that. But I think if you go on beyond that, and then all of a sudden your joints start hurting again, then I think that's something to pay more attention to, because I think that is a sign that it's not just your gut not being used to it. It's that your body actually doesn't like that, and it inflames your joints.
Right. And one of the things that I appreciate about how you approach everything is that, and I do the same thing. It's like, this is an experiment in an individual level for me to see, and I've done the same path as you, is trying to figure out what works best for me, where I feel the best, where I look the best, where I perform the best. And if that were to be for me a vegetarian or vegan diet, I would do it. And this is the thing too. It's like, it's not like we're trying to prove any type of point. It's more so just trying to find the truth of what works best for ourselves.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, if Twinkies and Skittles would make me a better athlete and have to ask me, I wish burger was a health food. I said, I wish it was too, because it tastes pretty good, but unfortunately it's not. And yeah, there's no, if I thought that a bunch of Brussels sprouts and spinach to my diet would make me better, I would do that. The problem is I've already done that. I've done that before, and I'm better off now. And so I think that's the bottom line. It's not some sort of dogmatic clinging to an ideology. It's just what's working for you health wise. And I think that if you want to call that being dogmatic, that you want to have the best health that you can, then so be it. But I think that's the only consideration here. It's not because some of the other diets, particularly veganism, is tied into things like animal welfare and environmental concerns. And it's not about that. It's purely about, health and performance.
Right. And I don't think that either of us are saying either that every single person needs to do this, but I think it's one of these diets where there's really no downside to trying it to see how you respond. And I think everybody's going to have an individual response due to their microbiome and due to environmental factors. But it's such an easy thing to implement versus, I mean, like some of the things that you've noticed in yourself versus with thousands of other people saying the benefits that they get. It's at least worth trying, in my opinion, to see what your change in an individual level would be.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think, again, and for many people, it's just a very good elimination diet. A lot of people, again, there's really two different populations. I think there's people that are sick and unhealthy, and they often a huge part in putting chronic diseases we see, and that's ubiquitous. Most of what we see out there these days is this chronic disease, and scratching their head, they're getting it. And I think that trying a diet, doesn't matter what it is, but certainly trying something like this is a very simple, and again, it's as simple as it gets. What do you eat? You eat a bunch of meat. It's not hard to implement at all. And seeing how you respond, and then you can kind of figure out, does it work for you? In many cases, the answer is yes. But then two, is there something else you can add to it? Maybe you can add fruit back in, maybe you can add some rice back in, maybe you can add in, certain vegetables back in. And I think that's completely fine, and people should look at doing that. Many people will find that they just prefer how they feel on staying pretty strict at it. And I think either way, it works well.
Yeah, and I think that one of the things too that a lot of people aren't looking at is that I think it's almost a self-imposed gut protocol for people to go on. So, I mean, I think that most people think more fiber is better, and there are some people out there who are going against the grain a little bit and showing that for most people, when they have a gut problem, they have more of an overgrowth of bacteria than an undergrowth. So adding any type of fiber whatsoever, like if you look at most gut protocols for overgrowth of bacteria, it's a liquid diet, because that means basically no fiber. And so what I think a lot of people are getting benefit from is a stage of basically killing off an overgrowth of bacteria, where I think a lot of people have problems that they don't realize. And so you're basically restricting fiber entirely and killing off all this stuff and allowing your body to get back to a normal state and providing with structure and foods with protein and fat that actually build up your tissues.
Yeah, I mean, we have this argument that fiber is completely essential to our gut microbiome. we sort of overlook the fact that, if we look at infants, I mean, most infants that are breastfed, and particularly traditionally, many kids they're breastfed for a couple of years before they have any fiber in their diet, and it's not like their microbiome is dying. What usually happens when you add fiber to those kids, initially with that, they get colic and they get gassy, and that's a problem for them. And so, again, I think that's just one human example where you can say that fiber is not necessary in that particular instance. I mean, some people will say that oligosaccharides sort of mimic fiber. I don't know that I really buy that. Fiber can be irritating for a lot of people. It is, indigestible. We don't have the capacity to break it down. We can have, bacteria that can ferment that stuff, and you can get a little bit of short chain fatty acids out of it. But yeah, I agree that the fact that sometimes subtraction is better than addition, rather than, having all these bacteria and then trying to put probiotics in there and continuing to feed the bad bacteria. It might be just eliminate the stuff, let those things die off, and what naturally is supposed to be there stays there.
Yeah, one of the things too that I think that people don't realize is that you don't really get much from vegetables or any plant matter that you can't get from animal products. And so when we look at things, people think that a carnivorous diet is a nutrient deficient diet. Can you just explain some of the myths and misconceptions here?
Yeah, well, I mean, the obvious thing to say is, well, there's all these people that are doing just fine, so they're not getting nutrient deficiency. And then you have to explain that. And when people try to explain that in the terms of things like the recommended daily allowances, we have to sort of realize how those things were developed. And those things were developed basically in the 1940s as an attempt to figure out what to feed soldiers in World War II. And, they looked at population deficiency studies, and they found out that populations eating X amount of nutrient would get a deficiency if it, at a certain level. But the problem with that is the populations they study are all these people eating a high grain-based, high carbohydrate-based diet. And we know metabolically, biochemically, that grains and carbohydrates in particular require different nutrients than diets that don't have that. So the reference ranges are completely skewed. They're not applicable. And so you can't say you don't get enough vitamin C because meat has a very small amount. Well, we also know that you require less vitamin C if you're not taking in as many carbohydrates. We know that vitamin C is more bioavailable from an animal-based source than it is from a plant-based source. And that goes on with all kinds of different nutrients, magnesium and all these minerals that are in food, but then we find that fiber and things like phytates, which are found in plant foods, bind those up and make them less accessible to us. And so not only do they does a plant food or a carbohydrate-based diet drive up the requirements for those nutrients, they also make them harder to get at. So, you kind of have a double whammy with nutrition, because the requirements go up. It makes it more difficult to get. When you're eating just a meat-based diet, the requirements go down, and then the nutrients are more bioavailable.
Right, and I think that one of the things here that people don't realize, that humans are animals, and we are comprised of certain types of structures. And eating animal products is the best way to build another animal. There's no doubt about that. And so if you look at whether your cells are made of, whether your DNA is made of, it's made of fat and protein, which is what you get from eating animal products. You don't get any building blocks, any structure from eating plants. Like, yes, there are some proteins, there are some amino acids, there are some fats to some degree, but the availability of you to be able to use that without any conversion steps is very, very limited, eating plants just versus eating the exact material that you're already made of. And this is something that if you want to thrive as a human, giving your body all this extra work to do to convert it into something usable is going to be, I think, a huge process that is just completely unnecessary. And I think there are a lot of good arguments as far as, why a vegetarian diet might be good, why a vegan diet might be good for certain reasons, but I don't think that we could ever claim that it's the best for health and general health, just from what we're made of and what plants are made of.
Yeah, I've made that argument before, and certainly I think that, again, if you compare a vegetarian, a vegan diet, or a lot of other diets compared to just a regular old junk food diet that most people are on, you're going to see a health improvement. There's no doubt about it. Now, is that ideal? Is that optimal? I would say no, it's not. There are certainly some people that can make it work. It often requires very careful meal planning, multiple meals, sometimes 6, 7, 8 meals a day, lots of supplementation, and they can do okay. I still think they're shortchanging their ultimate potential. Now, again, it's absolutely true, and this is a very simplistic way of looking at nutrition. But yeah, we are, humans, and I've operated on a lot of human beings and cut them open, and they're made out of red meat, and that's just the bottom line. I mean, and every animal cell has basically the same stuff in it. Now a liver cell might have a little more concentration of one nutrient versus another, but they generally all have the same thing. And so if you animal cell, whether that comes from, ribeye steaks or liver or brain or kidney or whatever, you're going to get what's in animal cells, and you're going to get what you need in the concentration you need it in. And generally the question is, well, how much do you need to get? And I would say the answer is simple. How hungry are you? That's why you have an appetite in the first place. When you're getting the food that you're designed to eat or optimally eat, your appetite's going to work pretty well. And that's why so many people find that they can eat without counting macros, and they're not, for general. Now, I think when you get off into specialization, when you have particular athletic goals, you have certain, performance goals, body composition goals, you have to be a little more meticulous about that stuff. But I think from a general health standpoint, how do I just become a healthy, normal, general human being? I think just eating to appetite, eating animal products is a very good strategy to get you there.
Yeah, I think one of the things that I noticed, and I think there are several reasons why this is, but I can eat until I'm stuffed, but I'm never going to be overly full like I would be even eating salads. Like I will eat to satisfaction, and I like, it's so difficult to overeat. Like I try to do it at times because I don't think I'm getting enough food, or I know I'm going to be fasting for the next day or so. So I want to have a lot of food intake, but it's almost impossible to feel overly full, like uncomfortably full, like I would if I'm eating vegetables and meat. Have you experienced this at all either?
Yeah, I mean, it is difficult, and it's kind of interesting that you bring that up, because I am currently trying to put on some sizes. I'm trying to hit some powerlifting numbers, and I'm literally eating beyond what I would normally eat appetite-wise, and it's not very pleasant. I mean, I'm literally sitting here, for me, I'll eat, and I eat quite a bit. I'm 250 pounds or so I'm a big guy, and I'm pretty active. So I'll go through about 4 pounds of steak a day every day, and that's pretty much keeps me happy, satisfied, and at a very lean and stable body weight. To go beyond that, I've got to push that, trying to get in about 6 pounds a day. And it's become a chore, and it's not as pleasant. And it's just because I want to push the envelope from an athletic standpoint. But I think, it's very difficult to overeat to try and intentionally gain weight on this sort of thing. I think it keeps you at a healthy, lean weight normally. And so, it's a struggle. I'm literally, hopefully I'll get to where I need to be body weight wise pretty quickly, and then I can get back to maintenance, because it's a job.
Yeah. And one of the things too, I think, is just about the hyperpalatability we have with most foods now, and just eating so many different foods in a meal. It makes it so simple to just be like, okay, I'm eating this one thing. And if you eat one thing, your hunger is going to regulate itself pretty closely to what you need. There were, I would say, very few times where humans throughout history would have several different things to eat at a meal, every single meal. And I think that having this variety in our diet is an artificial thing that modernity has provided us with, that allows us to overeat because things are so new. I have a bite of this, then I have a bite of this, then I have dessert, and then I have that. And it makes it so easy to overeat. Whereas if you have just one signal from one food, I think you get full at a really normal rate. I think I was overeating a lot before. I mean, not a ridiculous amount. I was still eating like a ketogenic type of diet and whole foods. But I think transitioning to this, my body has been able to kind of regulate a little bit closer to, I think, just real food, eating one type of food. And so even if I go back, I'm almost thinking of, okay, if I'm going to start eating vegetables, maybe I'll just have broccoli or just have this and see what my body feels like. And so like it can get bored with the food instead of stuffing it with all this variety.
Yeah, absolutely. Again, the variety we have, we go in the grocery store and there's literally 10,000 items to choose from. That is absolutely a modern artifice. We didn't have that, even a couple hundred years ago. I mean, most people ate, basically the same 4 or 5 things day in and day out. And, if we go back, farther than that, say we go back to the invention of agriculture, maybe 20,000 years ago. I mean, there wasn't much on the menu. I mean, people ate the same thing day in and day out for their whole lives. And, there's sort of debate on how long those folks lived. That's always been confused with, average population studies. Those are actuarial data. Doesn't count the account that takes into account infant mortality stuff. And so we certainly know there's evidence that there are people who live pre-agriculture that lived actually a pretty long life, and they, from their fossil evidence, show that their bones were in good shape. They had stronger muscle attachments. They were taller, bigger, larger brain vaults, probably larger brains. And it's pretty clear that they ate a lot of animal products. I mean, there's some good radioisotope data from Europe, from again pre-agricultural time, that shows that the humans were as carnivorous or more carnivorous than animals like wolves. When we compare the bones side to side, so they were eating a very meat-heavy diet. And I would argue that particularly during the time of year, it's only now that we can get strawberries in January if you live in the northern hemisphere, or whatever. Those things just. That's never happened before. We didn't have 31 flavors of ice cream and 25 flavors of potato chips and 75 different soft drinks to choose from. I mean, for most of mankind's history, it's been, meat, water, and maybe you could scrounge up a few plants. You might get a little bit of starch, a little bit of fruit and nuts here and there. But for the most part, I think meat was where the nutrition was, and I think that's what people knew, and that's what they sought out.
Yeah, one of the things I want to touch back on that you mentioned briefly before was that we don't have appropriate RDAs or even lab reference ranges when you take blood work. And I know this is something we're trying to figure out, and you're doing a really good job at spearheading this. But even on a ketogenic diet, there's this big problem that people try to extrapolate laboratory reference ranges of generally sick people onto somebody who's doing something that's just not well researched. And so you might have, for instance, a lower demand. Let's say you get a thyroid panel and your T3 is decreased a little bit. Well, maybe we don't need as much thyroid hormone when we're on a ketogenic diet. And I think that there's going to be a lot of things like this that come up with, for instance, a carnivore diet, that it's hard to extrapolate and live within reference ranges that are made for people who go to the doctor because they're sick on a traditional American diet. I know you've chatted recently with Rob Wolf about kind of this problem. Is there anything that you've learned since then about maybe reference ranges and how they can differ with a carnivore diet, and what you've seen with people that you've worked with?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I mean, again, the reference ranges, again, they were determined largely, a lot of those in the 1960s, 1970s, as some of the assays came out, and they looked at people on high carbohydrate diets. And so those reference ranges absolutely likely do not apply equally to all people on all different diets. And I think we have to come to terms with that fact and not call it pathology. We have to, because so many people, I know thyroid is a good example. I use the example of insulin, for instance. Most people would argue that keeping your level of insulin down is a good thing, which means the insulin receptor is more sensitive. We talk about insulin sensitivity being a good thing. And I think that is a general across the board thing. I think the more sensitive our receptors are, whether they're thyroid receptors, insulin receptors, leptin receptors, testosterone receptors, estrogen receptors, the more sensitive they are, the better that is, and the less hormone that needs to be created to support that, I think eventually is a good thing. No one is telling us that you got to crank up the amount of insulin you need. No one says more insulin equals better. A lot of cases they say, well, that's going to burn out the pancreas. And so I think it's a different way of thinking about stuff. I think we have to sort of take off our blinders and say that, hey, there's more things going on here. And I've seen that with all kinds of different data. Cholesterol is another example of this stuff, where we see that people on a ketogenic, low carb, carnivorous diet, their LDL cholesterol will go up, but everything else looks wonderful. I mean, their inflammation markers will be down, their insulin sensitivity will be very good, their triglyceride HDL ratio will be very good, and more importantly, they feel great. They're leaner. All of their mental health is better, their digestion's better, their joints are better. Every aspect about their health is better, and we have one marker that's sort of an outlier, and you have to ask, is that marker actually valid in this situation? I would argue it's probably not. And I think that's the case with a number of these things. And that's the problem we have, is there's no sophistication and there's no thoughtfulness when it comes to these lab values. It's just everybody tries to make it very black and white, and patients buy into that, and physicians don't see past it. They don't have very much good training in how to sort of really dig deep in this stuff. And a lot of it's just that the modern healthcare system is set up so, I mean, you got, 10, 15 minutes at most to see a patient, and you got to get a lot of stuff done, and half of it is just filling out paperwork. And so you don't have time to really look into this stuff. So everybody's put into this little algorithm, and not everybody fits in that algorithm. And so I think the low-carb population, people that are out there being these outliers like myself and some of these other carnivores, are at least raising some questions, and I think they should be raised.
Right. And one of the things that you mentioned too that I think should be really driven home is the fact that it's not all, like, health is not about a lab marker. And when I was testing a lot of people, when I was still in my day-to-day clinic, we would run these full panels and treat a lot of things, and they would feel subjectively incredible, the best that they've ever felt in their lives. But like you said, maybe LDL was a little high. Otherwise, everything else the inflammation was clear. Their gut health had returned to normal. Everything was amazing, but their LDL was a little high. Okay, so then they go talk to their primary care physician, and they want to put them on a statin and have them go back to a high carb diet to help fix that LDL number. And I think that what's important for people to realize that you are more than your lab markers. If something is out of range, it could be completely irrelevant to your actual total health as a human being.
Yeah, I agree. I think, this is the other thing with a lot of things, we measure blood markers because they're easy to get. It's easy to draw blood. It's harder to take a tissue biopsy. It's harder to, it's more time consuming to put through somebody through a banner of physical fitness tests, and, all these things that really are better at assessing someone's health. We don't do, but we do these lab tests because, they're easy to do. And, and often there's a drug that treats that. And I think, unfortunately, there's some of that going on as well, that we have a medical system that's educated by pharmaceutical companies. And so we have all these just associations. And again, the things with those labs is you probably have found that they can change in a matter of a couple of days. Your numbers can go up and down dramatically over a few days period, and all kinds of things impact that: how much sleep you got, what you ate the last few days, how much exercise you've had. So putting our faith in just one little number is, to me, I think is just a bad strategy.
Right. And so for people who want to learn more about the ridiculous variance, for instance, in a lipid panel, they can check out Dave Feldman's work. I even did so I just order my own blood work whenever I can get it really cheap. And I did what's called the Feldman Protocol of basically eating in excess, basically a ketogenic diet rich in saturated fat versus fasting. And those numbers can vary wildly from 2 days, 3 days, 4 days, or day to day. And so this is something that he's documented several times. I've done it myself and confirmed it. Your lab values are so dynamic. Your body is a dynamic system. And so taking a snapshot and judging what's going to happen with your health in the future and what you want to do and things, I think is very short-sighted.
Yeah, and I actually met with Dave a couple of days ago in Las Vegas, and we talked very much about that stuff. And I think it's, there's a lot more dynamic just besides cholesterol, but that's a very important point. He's shown that he could change his LDL cholesterol 100 points in a matter of a week, and that's a huge difference. 100 points. Your doctor one day he would say, "Oh, you're doing great," and then a week later he says, "Oh my gosh, you're going to die." So it's just almost it's if it wasn't so sad, it would almost be funny, and right. It's what Dave has shown is that basically cholesterol is trafficked around in response to overall sort of energy status in the body and how full you are, basically. And it has about a 3 or 4 day cycle. And he's shown that in the vast majority of people that do this, they can drop their total LDL cholesterol by 30% in a matter of, just a matter of 3 or 4 days.
So what are some of the other big myths about, for instance, consuming a massive amount of animal products that you've probably had to shoot down every day since you've been vocal about this? Like, for instance, meat causes cancer. Can you just address the nature of this argument?
Yeah, so I'll start with that one. There's a lot of them out there. So meat causes cancer. Again, that's something the World Health Organization put out in late 2016, I believe. And we look at what that was based on. They largely, almost exclusively based that on epidemiologic studies. And it showed basically a relative risk of about 18% with processed meat. And we got to look at what that actually means, and this is, again, particular just to colon cancer. So if the normal incidence of colon cancer is around 5%, you have a lifetime chance of about 5% of getting colon cancer. If you add meat to your diet based on these epidemiologic studies, it may go up to 6%. So it adds 1% risk, absolute risk on there, which is very minimal overall. But that presumes that the epidemiology is completely reliable. What we do know about epidemiology is, when they include people in those studies that eat meat, those are typically people that are eating the French fries, the Cokes, and the hamburger buns with their meat. And so we don't know if it's the meat or if it's the French fries fried in vegetable oils, the sugary drinks, or any of that stuff that goes with that. And so they never really do a great job of separating that stuff out. And even if you believe it to be true that it is a meat, it's only a 1% absolute difference. And now, beyond that, all they did was they of all the thousands of studies they looked at, they could only find 3 or 4 animal studies that supported that, and they had a whole bunch of animal studies that refute that show that no, it doesn't happen. There's actually studies on rats eating bacon where they saw that rats fed bacon had less incidence of cancer than those guys eating chicken. And so it's a very bad set of data that is based on epidemiology. Is an awful way to draw conclusions about what to eat on a diet. And there's all kinds of studies out there, randomized control trials that always sort of refute what the epidemiology shows. In fact, there was a nice study somebody posted a while ago showing that they looked at 12 sort of epidemiologic studies, and they had like 70 studies that were supposed to sort of confirm the epidemiology. Every single one of them, 100% of those studies did not agree with the epidemiology, which shows you how unreliable using epidemiology is. The World Health Organization has come under tremendous fire for those proclamations. And, I think there's a lot of people that strongly disagree with, their methods, the way they chose that, and what it actually does. And we think about it, when we look at relative risk, let's just say, for instance, that eating meat, there's an 18% chance you're going to get colon cancer based on their study and based on relative risk. Well, let's look at all the other relative risks out there. We know that obesity has a much higher relative risk for developing colon cancer. What happens to people that only eat meat? They generally get leaner. We look at inflammation markers. What happens with inflammation and relative risk for cancer? If your inflammation goes up, your relative risk for cancer goes way up. Well, what happens with meat eaters that only eat meat? Their inflammation markers go way down. The same thing can be said for hyperinsulinemia and for all kinds of other factors that meat eating seems to improve. So if we were to play the relative risk game, you would see that meat eating, particularly when we're only looking at meat eating, drives you so far negative that one little elevation risk on epidemiology is actually minuscule at this point.
Right. And so people who just aren't aware of what epidemiology is versus like a randomized controlled trial, I think that people who aren't used to reading studies will think that, oh, well, it shows that this is that. So epidemiology is essentially taking large scale surveys and deducing conclusions from that, which is, like you said, very poor way to guide specific nutritional outcomes from that. Maybe it'll give us a theory, which we should dive into with a randomized controlled trial. But it's like saying as well, like let's say on that survey, people who wore khakis instead of jeans also had a relative risk of 18% higher colon cancer. Okay, does that mean that the khakis are the ones that, or what causes that? Of course not. And so that's what you said, like these are also people who are probably engaging in other behaviors, or who, people who are taking the government recommendation on eating less meat or eating less fat are the people who are probably making other better lifestyle choices. And so maybe that, accounts for some of these changes and some of the positivity in that. But yes, I don't think we can make specific nutritional guideline recommendations, especially placing foods like animal products in, aren't they classified as a carcinogen? No?
Yeah, they've classified processed meat as a class 1 carcinogen and red meat as a class 2 carcinogen, which means probable. Again, that again, that's very based on just really, really bad science, and a lot of people have pointed that out. And I think that it does need to have some randomized controlled trials. We need to. What needs to be done is we need to look at people that only eat meat, like myself and some of the other people on a carnivorous diet, and see what happens to their lab markers and compare them to a standard American diet. And I think that's that's something that's done, and compare them to other diets. And I think that is how we best sort of show whether or not meat is actually harmful or not. And I would argue, based on what I've seen in now thousands of people, where their blood pressure is improving, their markers of disease like insulin are getting better, their triglyceride HDL ratio is getting better, their C-reactive protein levels are all getting better. All of those things are associated with cancer, and yet all of those things get better when you go on a meat-only diet.
So another one that I think that people have a hard time with, and me, I'm posting all over Instagram now as well about the carnivore experiment that I'm on, and I'm getting blasted with all these things saying how could I ever kill an animal, and then it's not ethical to kill an animal. And so, I mean, I'm sure you have a point of view on this as well, but I mean, I don't think that either of us are ever for supporting a system that has animals locked in cages and walking around their own feces and jammed together. Like, that's not what this is about. That's to say that every way of eating an animal is of that. I mean, there's a lot of other alternatives to that. For instance, the farm where I get the ranch up here north of Austin, where I get all of my meat from, they either catch wild boar or raise a cow to have a much better life than it would in the wild. I mean, this is one of the things, like, an animal is going to die and has a life cycle, no matter if you like it or not. And this is the stark reality of it, is that things live and things die. Animals do that, and we're going to do that. And that's just the way it is. So if you look at that from an ability for us to keep an animal safe and well nurtured through its whole life, and then for that life cycle to then nurture us, I mean, I don't think you can argue that, especially when you look at sheer numbers of, if you plow through a field and harvest, let's say, a bunch of wheat, how many crop kills that you're going to be having. I mean, I don't think the size of the animal determines the value of its life either. So if you have thousands of rabbits and snakes and things like that get killed through harvesting a monocrop, I think that I've done calculations where you're actually causing more death eating a vegan or vegetarian diet than in an animal-based diet. Can you just speak on this just briefly?
Well, I think, again, it's not all black and white. Certainly. And, any sort of food you eat, any existence you have on the planet, whether it's food or consumable goods, whether driving a car, having a computer, having furniture, is going to have an impact on the environment. There's no doubt about it. Just you being alive is causing a stress on the planet. So there's no getting around that. Now, you can argue and sort of put your flag in the ground and saying this is unacceptable, and it's going to be something that I feel passionately about. But that's not very realistic, and it's a little bit hypocritical. Sure, yeah, there's something called the sentience quotient, where how many animals get killed. It is 10 rabbits getting killed less harmful than one cow being killed. I mean, that's for someone to debate. I don't know the answer to that. I would say that no matter what you eat, eating for you being alive is causing some sort of other creature to die, whether it's a plant, whether it's an animal, whether it's some bacteria. It's circle of life stuff. It's simplistic, but as far as how animals are treated, and we have this sort of, this is a thing that people don't challenge. The vegan sort of propaganda army tells us that every animal that makes it to the supermarket has had some horrible existence, has been locked in a pen, has been beaten every day by its owner and killed in a horrific way. That's not the reality. Now, that may happen occasionally, and certainly those people that do that should not be allowed to do that, and there should be laws that prevent that, and there are laws to prevent that. And I would certainly say, with regard to cattle in particular, cattle spend 80% of their life on pasture, roaming around, regardless of how they're finished. Now, the ones that go for grain finishing are going to spend 20% of their lives in what's considered a confined feeding operation. And so, but that doesn't mean they're stuck together. They can't move. They walk in and out freely. They just have a place where they centrally gather and eat. If you look at most of the grain finishing places, 93% of them in the U.S. have less than 1,000 head of cattle. So it's not the situation where you have hundreds of thousands of cattle shoved in on each other. Now, I will say things like the poultry industry probably have more work to do, because they, particularly if you have a chicken in there that can't turn around in a cage, that's unacceptable to me. I understand why they put them in cages, because they'll peck each other apart. I mean, they're vicious and they'll fight each other and injure each other. But, there's ways to do that, and there's ways we can improve that. But again, there is a big sort of misunderstanding and a skewing of what our perception is about how animals are raised based on vegan propaganda. And it does not represent the vast majority of what's going on. We have to understand that. It's not black and white. There's a lot of gray areas there. And additionally, again, all these cows that we eat, and we do eat them, and we have to. I mean, there are food, basically, and then that's just the reality of it. It's a sad reality, but it's a reality. We have to eat to stay alive and to stay healthy, and that's what we need to eat. But if you look at a cow in the wild or another ruminant animal in the wild, most of their infants do not make it to adulthood. Most of them are killed by predators, and it's not a very nice death. And most of them are killed at a very young age in infancy. That's why they have larger numbers of those animals are produced, because most of them get killed. And it's just the way it is. And the fact that we, our farmers and ranchers protect those animals, they care for them, they look out for their welfare. They want them to be healthy. They want them to be free of disease as long as possible. And then ultimately they know they're going to be killed for food. But at the same time, they protect those animals. They go out in the freezing cold and the rain, and they take care of the animals when they're sick. They bring them into their houses. They bring them into their inside. They shelter them. And again, we've got to congratulate these people instead of demonizing them.
Right. So what are some of the other, is this let's say everybody, obviously not tomorrow, but over the course of time, switch to a carnivorous diet? Is this a scalable approach? Because this is a lot of backlash too, where people think, oh, this is a pie in the sky idea, and that this would ruin the planet because we'd have to raise so many animals for people. Have you done the math, or have you known of anybody to do the math on scalability of this as an applicable approach to nutrition?
Right. Well, I mean, what I do personally is not what the world would do. I mean, I'm obviously an athlete pushing the extremes. I'm a big guy. I'm eating a lot more than most people eat of any food. It doesn't matter what diet I'm going to eat more than the average person, right? But I've done some of the math with Peter Ballestedt, who's a forage agronomist who kind of knows some of this math, and he calculated that in order for every human being on the planet to get 1 pound of beef, okay, which would be a tremendous improvement in what's going on. Typically in the world, it's less than like an ounce per person. If you look at all the third world nations and stuff like that, but to move that up to about a pound a day for every person on the planet would require approximately doubling of our cattle supply, which we could very easily do. We have the room to do, but we would have to adopt better efficiency standards, because most of the way cattle is raised around the world, particularly in third world countries, Africa, Southeast Asia, and some other places, is very inefficient. So in order to do that, we do have the land to do that, and we would just have to adopt the efficiency standards and the distribution standards to meet that goal of, say, 1 pound per person for every person on the planet. And that is doable. And again, no one's going to adopt 100% the same diet. It's never going to happen. So that's a moot point. It's not even worth discussing. Now, what is worth discussing is, can animal agriculture be a net positive for health and for the environment? I think it can be, particularly if the animals are pastured appropriately. There's some good data out there showing that if animals are pastured appropriately, it can actually reverse some of the global climate change and some of the greenhouse gas effect through carbon sequestration and methane sequestration. And so it can be done. It's just a matter of the willpower to do it and, the political force to do it. Right now we have a huge political movement that's sort of driving us towards plant-based and processed food-based. And quite honestly, let's just face it for what it is. It's really a processed food push, and it's basically backed by the processed food companies that want to make a huge profit on synthetic meats and stuff of that nature. So they, of course, are going to put a lot of propaganda and dollars into supporting an environmental argument and an ethical argument because it suits their financial goals.
Right. And I think you make a good point here about it can actually be an environmental positive having a more animal agriculture system set up. For instance, when we eradicated all of the buffalo and didn't replace any of them, I mean, this is where we get the Dust Bowl. When we have monocrops, we look at, just growing one crop in an area for a long period of time. We make that area, there's this desertification that we turn the landscape extremely arid and nutrient deficient. And it's been shown that having ruminants, especially, trample over the grass, eat it all, have their manure spread around, and then putting them from one area to another actually helps drastically improve the local ecology in the system. So I think that we have a lot of work to do there. Are there any other major myths or misconceptions or things that you have to answer multiple times on a daily basis?
Yeah, I mean, the whole thing about meat rotting in your intestines and you having constipation, I think
Right.
that is another myth. And I think it's something that, more and more people are understanding. As more and more people do this, they find that that's not at all what happens. Basically because meat is so well absorbed by the small intestine. We have all these tremendous ways. We have a very acid, hydrochloric acid-based stomach system, gastric system that dissolves the meat. We have all kinds of, pepsins and trypsins and all these other proteases in our small intestine, which absorb that. We have all these dipeptide transporters for things in meat like carnosine, carnitine, that are directly absorbed into the intestine. So we have this huge system that's set up perfectly to absorb meat. And, we've got ileostomy patient studies where we can look at what comes out of the small intestine. And when you eat meat, nothing really comes out. It's all absorbed in the small intestine. So it doesn't sit there and rot in your colon. The only thing that makes it to your colon is a little bit of liquid, which you then have to reabsorb, liquid and minerals. And so there's no such thing as meat rotting in your colon. And constipation is, you have less bowel movements and you have smaller bowel movements, but it's not because you're constipated. It's just because you're not wasting all that food you're taking. And when you're on a high fiber, high vegetative diet, I mean, most of the nutrition or a large part of the nutrition just goes straight from your mouth to the toilet and you can't even access it. And that's why you have these, large bowel movements, which I would argue are in no way necessary and does not point to good health. There's no evidence that, good evidence that shows that is in any way linked to better health.
Right. And I think that people get confused that there are different parts of your digestive system. And so, for instance, you have a small intestine and a large intestine. And then the small intestine, the job, to put it in a very simple term, is to extract nutrition from your food and put it in your bloodstream so you can actually use it. The large intestine is to kind of soak up whatever's left over and to prepare it for excretion. And this is where people get the putrefaction question wrong, in my opinion, whereas protein in your large intestine, if it does not get absorbed, maybe there's a hypothetical situation where that can lead with some type of bacteria to some putrefaction. But the irony of this is that plant protein is the stuff that isn't absorbed very well in your small intestine, therefore leading to large intestine putrefaction. I mean, do you have anything to add there? I mean, is that accurate?
Yeah, that's exactly accurate. I mean, putrefaction, it's not a very nice sounding word because we just have a bad connotation to that, but it's the same thing as fermentation. It's just the bacterial action of, fermentation is a bacterial action on carbohydrates, and putrefaction is a bacterial action on protein. And you're absolutely correct. Plant proteins have a harder time being absorbed by the small intestine, and thus plant proteins, if anything, spend more time in the large intestine being putrefied. There's a nice ileostomy study looking at soy protein versus animal protein, and that's exactly what it showed. The soy protein was more likely to not be absorbed by the small intestine and get into the large intestine where it would undergo putrefaction. So, if you want to say putrefaction is bad, then don't eat plant protein because you're going to get more putrefaction with plant protein.
So you, on a daily basis, you're eating like 4 to 6 pounds, like closer to the 6 pound range right now. Is it just primarily? I know you're a big ribeye fan. I see you on your Instagram. You're loading up cartfuls every day. Is it just ribeyes? Are you getting in organ meats? Are you switching up and having different cuts of meat? What's your approach here? Is it just kind of whatever comes?
It's pretty much been fattier cuts of meat, as I find that to be more satisfying. I think there's an evolutionary argument to be made why we prefer fattier cuts of meat. I think our initial initially humans, ate and very, very successfully hunted large ruminant animals and things like mammoths and elephants, which were fattier animals. And I think that's one of the reasons we evolved that way. And I think we need the fat. And so I tend to preference the fattier cuts. I don't go out of my way to eat organ meats. I don't find that it's necessary. I think it goes back to this. An animal cell is an animal cell, and if you eat enough animal cells, you're going to get what you need, from doing that. And so I've done just perfectly fine, straight up with just pretty much steaks. Sometimes I'll have some eggs. Every once in a while, I'll add some seafood. Typically it'll be shrimp. But I mean, for the most part, I'd say 99% of my diet is just some sort of steak, red meat, and it's often a ribeye.
Yeah, and so another question here that I think I get asked a lot too, because I'm so, we have Perfect Keto, which is such a keto heavy focus, and going to this, people have this crazy fear on ketosis that if you eat protein over, 0.8 grams per kilogram, that you're going to get kicked out of ketosis and that, your whole life is going to go down the toilet. And so I've actually, I'm eating around 2 to 3 pounds per day of meat. I'm a gaunt child compared to you, so I don't need 6 pounds. But when we look at this, I'm at 0.8 to 1.0 millimolars on a ketone meter. So I'm technically in ketosis most of the time. I'm also fasting way more now because I have a giant meal and I'm just not hungry. And so people who are worried about this, I think that they think that gluconeogenesis is something that just will happen no matter what if you go over a certain protein threshold that is set per individual. And I just don't think that's true. And I think that I'm proving that to be true. I mean, I'm getting between probably 150 and 180 grams of protein minimum on a day, and I'm still in ketosis. Have you experienced this yourself?
I've never been one to measure my own ketones. I've seen a lot of numbers on people, and many of them stay in ketosis on what would seem to be a fairly heavy amount of protein. I do think that gluconeogenesis, it's mostly a demand-driven process, and I think, for instance, because my blood glucose tends to run a little bit higher just because of all the glycolytic activity I do, and I think I require that. But going from 4 pounds of meat a day, which is something like 400 grams, to 6 pounds, which is 600 grams, has had no impact on my blood sugar. My blood sugar stays about the same as it is. So if it were purely eating too much protein equals more blood sugar, then I would expect a significant rise in my blood sugar based on those numbers, just the pure amount of volume of protein I'm eating. So that doesn't seem to make sense. And I would say that, certainly, ultimately, the goal of any diet or eating strategy is to, make you healthier, and whether that's done through body composition or whatever else you want to use, whatever metric you want to use to determine you're healthy, whether it's the way you feel, the way you perform, the way your joints feel, that is the ultimate goal. And it's not, let's always keep our blood ketones above 0.5, because I think that, again, that's one of those artificial things that can change. We know that some people get more efficient at utilizing ketones, particularly in athletics. We know that, production plus excretion plus utilization are going to give you some number. And so it's also fairly dynamic. And so I think too many people get hung up on, eating to hit a blood value rather than eating for health. And I think you have to sort of distance yourself from this hyper-managing certain blood values, which we don't fully understand yet. I mean, even the guys that are experts in ketosis will tell you that there are things we don't know. And I think we have to keep that in the back of our mind.
Yeah, I think that there's no award, at least that I'm aware of the highest ketone level for the longest period of time.
Yeah, I mean, there's some people that think so, and it's like they're bragging by showing their ketone meter, and I'm just like, well, that's great, but what does that really mean? And I'm not sure. I don't know that anyone knows, and I'm the first person to say I don't know it all. There's a lot of things we don't know, and but it's fun to learn about that. But ultimately, again, you got to keep the ultimate goal, and the ultimate goal is human health, and I don't think you define that by a blood ketone level or an LDL level.
Right. And one of the things, too, that I always mention is nutrient density of food. And you look at a nutrient density chart, and the reason why I think it's interesting that you say you don't really, you don't go out of your way to eat organ meat. And so I think that, if you look at a scale, organ meat's at the highest, very clearly, of nutrient density. Then very closely afterwards is just animal protein and animal products in general. And then way below that, spices and herbs, and then below that, vegetables, and then below that, nuts and seeds, and then fruit, and then most carbohydrate rich foods like grains. And so I think that, for most people, eating a 10 to 20% animal product diet might need to for sure add in some organ meat to balance that spectrum out a little bit. But because you're up in having 100% of your nutrition at that higher end of that phase, I'm assuming that you're not going to need as much of that organ meat as somebody who, let's say, I think that if like second to carnivore would probably be if you had to choose like a vegan or vegetarian diet plus organ meat, if you're going to balance out nutrition as much as possible. So it's kind of an interesting fact that you're probably getting way more nutrition than most other people, counterintuitive to what people think about how nutrition is assimilated. And I think that you actually, we were chatting before that we were recording today, how you're in hot water about your association of nutrients you get and how that might affect mental status. You just want to dive in about how you've been attacked about that?
Well, I mean, it's not. I mean, I don't think anyone out there will say that. Well, there may be some people who are oblivious to this fact, but I think it's very clear that nutrition impacts mental health. I mean, just like our brain is part of our physiology, and we know that poor nutrition negatively impacts physiology, whether it's diabetes, high blood pressure, or arthritis, or any of those things. But mental health disorders are also just the same thing. They're just a disease of physiology. And I think that nutrition makes a big impact on that. So I just commented on the recent, the fact that there was a recent shooting that involved a vegan activist that kind of obviously is mentally imbalanced and went in there and shot a bunch of people and killed herself. And I think not to point out that a vegan diet necessarily is what caused this, but I think in general, we have to look at the fact that nutrition, whether it's nutrient poor from lack of animal protein or animal fats in a vegan diet potentially, or a standard American junk food diet that's also tries to be a low fat diet that's just full of garbage. I mean, those things impact our mental health tremendously. And some people were upset that I posted that and saying, "Hey, look, we need to look at nutrition." If they would have said this person was a carnivore and killed all these people, I would say the same thing. We need to look at nutrition as it impacts mental health. The fact that the headline showed a dietary strategy, and if the person went off the deep end, shows to me, no matter what the diet is, diet plays a role in mental health, and we need to recognize that. And because it always degenerates into the same old thing, it's a gun control argument. Whether you're pro or con, that is irrelevant. When it comes to mental health, because it's all in the end point, whoever's pulling that trigger is somebody who has a mental health issue, and we need to figure out what's driving those mental health issues. And some people will say it's the antidepressants. Well, I would say the person went on an antidepressant because they had a mental health issue. So we got to go back even farther. And I think there's a lot of people that would agree that bad nutrition leads to mental health problems. And it may be, and maybe some of these people go even worse being on certain drugs. But at the bottom line, the core sort of root cause, in my view, again, it goes back to nutrition.
Yeah, I mean, and that's why I've dedicated my life to doing what I'm doing as well, because I think nutrition is so fundamental to every other pillar of health, and that you're never going to have good materials to have good brain chemistry if you eat things that your brain, if you don't eat things that your brain needs. Where do you think that the carnivore diet goes next, as far as next year, next 2 years, it becomes more popular? Do you think there is certain people who kind of break it down and do it for certain goals? What is your anticipation?
Well, I think that, I suspect it'll continue to get more and more popular. You see it spreading over throughout social media, and we're seeing, more and more people. I think it's going to go more mainstream. I know there are some pretty high level athletes that are starting to take this on, and particularly if they have success, it will continue to sort of take root in that community. I think hopefully there will be some formal study that gets done on this stuff, because I think, again, there are some really neat sort of situations where people with things like autoimmune diseases, things like Crohn's disease, ulcerative colitis, rheumatoid arthritis, psoriasis, eczema, are seeing those things go away. And I think that is extremely intriguing, and I think it deserves study. I know the group out of Hungary, Paleomedicina, is doing some formalized study on this, but hopefully that'll, they're considered renegades and kind of sort of considered pariahs in the medical community there. But at the same time, I think eventually this is going to catch on as more healthcare providers like yourself, myself, and others start to utilize this, that there's going to be hopefully some bona fide study that goes into this stuff, particularly, for patients that sit there with these horrible, horrible crippling diseases that their doctors can't figure out. And it could be just as simple as, hey, let's eliminate, some plants out of your diet and see how you do. And, I think there's, hopefully enough physicians out there that are willing to do that, and enough patients that are willing to at least try it for a period of time. But I think it'll get, I don't think it'll go anywhere but expand and get more popular over time.
Yeah. And I mean, again, anybody could do it. It's like, if you don't feel good after a month, you can stop at any time. There's no obligation to continue it if you don't feel well. And so, that's why I always suggest people, if they're interested in it, just to try it out. I feel phenomenal, probably the same as you felt after, I think this is my 4th week, and probably the highest consistent energy levels that I've had throughout my entire life. I'm not hungry. I don't think about food, and I just feel on fire the entire day. And that's what I want. And that's how I want to feel. So who knows what that looks like for me in the future. I'm going to experiment some more, but yeah, that's my short testimonial.
Yeah, I think you're not alone. There's a lot of people saying that. Well, it's been a interesting discussion.
Yeah, well, thank you for continuing the discussion. I'm sure we'll have tons of questions on this podcast, so maybe we'll shoot some for you for another round too. I know you got to get out of here, but thanks for being on the show. And why don't you just let people where they can find you if they want to learn more about your Instagram, especially. I think you put a lot of good concepts up there about studies that come out and everything supporting this way of eating.
Yeah, so Instagram is Shawn, SHAWN, Baker, BAKER, 1967. I'm still fairly active on Twitter with SBakerMD. The website, meatheals.com. So meatheals.com is a good reference. We have all kinds of people putting up their testimonials. And then I've got a little workout training program called Carnivore Training System.com as well. We're going to do a rowing program, as I've broken several rowing world records. So there's a rowing supplement to that people are excited about. And then I'm going to have a website, shawn-baker.com, coming out soon, where I'll try to put a little bit more of the scientific content down there and do some other stuff on that site. So those are the places where I'll be active in the near future.
Well, thanks, Doc, for all you do.
Hey, man, Anthony, it was great talking to you, and hopefully I'll get to meet you in person sometime.
All right, buddy. We'll chat soon.
Okay, take care.
All right, everyone. Thanks for listening to another episode of the Keto Answers podcast. I hope you enjoyed it, but even if you didn't, I would love a review. Just go over to iTunes, wherever you listen to your podcast, and pop in a review so we can get found by more people, get better guests, and have the information that you need. So please go to iTunes, wherever you listen to your podcast, and leave us a review. And if you're new to keto, head on over to perfectketo.com/podcast and enter your email for all our top tips and guides on getting started with the ketogenic diet. Thanks, and we'll see you next time.